Derek Thompson published a Substack piece with an interesting title recently. If America's so rich, how did it get so sad? If you look at the U.S. from a distance, the picture can seem almost absurdly bright. Low unemployment, solid growth compared with other rich countries, rising wages, especially for workers who used to get the smallest share of the gains. By a lot of usual scorecards, this has been a pretty strong decade. And yet, when you ask Americans how they feel, you get something closer to a national shrug, or even a wince. Why does a country that's doing so well on paper sound so unhappy out loud? Thompson walks us through a puzzle that's hard to ignore. Since around 2020, American self-reported happiness and satisfaction have dropped sharply, and they haven't really recovered. Call it the opposite of the roaring 20s, more like the tragic 20s. Let's start with a basic observation. An economist at the University of Chicago, Sam Peltzman, looked at decades of data from the General Social Survey and found something striking. After about 50 years of relatively stable self-reported well-being, there's a sudden step down after COVID. Not a gentle decline, not a slow drift, a break. And it's not just one data set telling the story. Worker satisfaction measures have slid to record lows. Consumer sentiment surveys have cratered to levels that are shocking, even if you remember the Great Recession or the inflationary 1970s. Internationally, the U.S. has fallen to its lowest ever ranking in the World Happiness Report, with young people driving a lot of that drop. So we have two realities at once. A fairly sturdy economy in many traditional respects, and a population that keeps telling pollsters they're miserable. Some people try to wave this away by saying, well, surveys are squishy. Feelings aren't facts. But feelings are a kind of fact. They change how people spend, how they talk, how they treat each other, and how they vote. Mood shapes politics. Politics shapes policy. And policy shapes the economy we're all trying to measure. So if we want to understand where the country is going, we can't treat sentiment like a rounding error. Okay, so what happened? Who killed the vibes? One detail from Peltzman's work is especially important. This isn't just a story about one group. You might assume the biggest decline would be among people who are already more vulnerable to anxiety or loneliness, like younger adults, lower income households, or people without partners. But the drop shows up everywhere. Across age, gender, education, ideology. A broad 10 to 15 point hit, remarkably uniform. That's a clue, because it suggests the cause isn't something niche that affects only one slice of society. Something big happened, and it hit almost everybody. So any explanation has to fit the timeline. It needs to surge around 2020, and then crucially, it needs to linger. That timing knocks out a few popular theories. For instance, some people might point to long-run cultural change, like declining religious affiliation. It's true that religion can correlate with community and meaning for many people, but secularization has been trending for decades. It doesn't match a sudden mood collapse that begins in 2020. Others might say it's inequality. And sure, inequality matters in a lot of ways. But here's the complication. In the years after the pandemic, wage growth at the bottom has actually been unusually strong, and median incomes are higher than they were a decade ago. Plus, some of the steepest happiness declines show up among groups you wouldn't automatically label as economically desperate, like college graduates and older, well-established Americans. So inequality alone doesn't cleanly explain the pattern either. Then there's the obvious villain in so many modern-day stories, smartphones and social media. They're tied up with declining well-being, especially for young people, but that trend started well before 2020. It's more like a slow burn problem that's been building for 10 or 15 years, not a sudden break that happens right when the pandemic hits and then refuses to heal. So if it's not primarily secularization, not primarily inequality, and not primarily just phones, what is it? Here's the simplest umbrella idea. As a cultural and political force, the pandemic never really ended. Not biologically, maybe, but socially, economically, psychologically, we're still living in its aftershocks. You could call it the permademic, a pandemic that stops being only a virus and becomes a lasting condition of life. Let's break that into a few parts. First, inflation, or more accurately, the lived experience of inflation. Economists tend to discuss inflation as annual rates, a number that rises and falls like a weather report. But households don't experience inflation as a neat average. They experience it as a repeated moment of disbelief. The grocery trip that costs more than it should. The rent renewal that feels like a dare. The restaurant bill that feels like a prank. And while the inflation rate has moved around over the last few years, the cumulative price level is what people actually confront. In the span from 2020 to 2025, consumer prices rose about as much as they did in the long stretch from 2007 to 2020. And housing tells an even more dramatic version of the story. Home prices jumped with a speed that made the pre-pandemic years feel calm by comparison. So when everyday life starts to feel like it's sliding out of reach, people don't calm down just because a chart says inflation is cooling. They remember the jump. They remember what things used to cost. Affordability becomes a constant mental itch. There's also an interesting twist here. An economics writer, Matt Darling, has looked at how consumer sentiment typically relates to basic fundamentals like unemployment, inflation, and interest rates. Around 2020, that old relationship breaks. Sentiment plunges far below where you'd predict it should be based on the standard indicators. The gap has a name now, the vibe session, where the vibes are in recession even if the economy isn't, at least not in the typical sense. And surprisingly, the biggest shortfall in sentiment relative to expectations shows up among higher income households. One explanation is uncomfortable but plausible. In a world of tight labor markets, services that rely on other people's time get more expensive and harder to schedule. Childcare costs more, repairs take longer, eating out costs more, even convenience starts to feel scarce. For decades, many Americans, especially those with more money, got used to frictionless affordability. Then suddenly, the price of convenience rises, and it feels like a loss of control. Not necessarily a loss of income, but a loss of ease. The result is a country that, across the income distribution, feels like it's paying more and getting less. And in democracies, that frustration doesn't stay in private conversation. It turns political. If everything feels unaffordable, voters punish incumbents, even if those incumbents can't easily unwind global supply shocks or housing shortages. That backlash showed up not only in the U.S., but around the world in 2024, when incumbent parties took beating after beating. Now, if inflation is one big part of the story in the U.S., it leads to another question. Why does the West, and especially English-speaking countries, seem hit so hard on happiness measures in recent years, while some other places have seen improved well-being? In the World Happiness Report, countries like China, India, and Vietnam show gains, but much of the decline clusters in the Anglosphere, the U.S., Canada, the U.K., Ireland, Australia, New Zealand. Researchers have suggested that these countries share a few traits that might make them especially vulnerable. A stronger culture of individualism, a very intense and often negative media ecosystem, and what you might call diagnostic expansion, where more conditions get labeled and measured, which increases awareness and reporting of mental distress. There's also a more specific link back to inflation. Some of the European countries that saw happiness rise in the 2020s, like Portugal, Italy, and Spain, also had comparatively lower inflation than places like the UK and Germany. That doesn't prove inflation is the whole story, but it strengthens the case that cost of living shocks are a major ingredient in this decade's sour mood. Okay, that was part one of the permademic, the economic aftershock, especially inflation and affordability. Part two is institutional trust and how pandemics can change a society's social fabric. Historically, large outbreaks tend to erode trust. And in the U.S. in the 2020s have been a brutal decade for confidence in institutions. Trust has fallen across the board. Government, business, education, religion, and many of the expert systems that were thrust into the spotlight during COVID, like public health agencies and medicine. But maybe the more haunting drop is the trust in each other. There's a long-running question in surveys that basically asks, do you think most people would try to take advantage of you, or would they try to be fair? For a long time, Americans leaned toward people are mostly fair. Since 2020, that belief has dropped sharply. And when you stop expecting basic decency from strangers, everyday life becomes more stressful. You approach interactions defensively. You interpret mistakes as malice. You assume the worst, and that mindset is exhausting. At the same time, we've seen a rise in solitude. Americans spend more time alone and more time at home than in previous eras, and that changes what society feels like. Instead of being mediated by the ordinary, humanizing texture of real-world encounters, More of our experience of other people gets filtered through screens and feeds. And online environments tend to reward conflict. Negativity travels faster. Outrage gets amplified. People become symbols of teams rather than neighbors with quirks and decent intentions. Someone you might chat with normally at work or in a bar becomes, on the internet, a villain in a story you're being nudged to believe. Now we get to part 3, the 2020s as a perma-crisis decade. Even if inflation had been mild, even if institutions were steady, this has been a period of relentless stressors. Pandemic disruption bleeds into inflation. Inflation bleeds into political backlash. Then add the war in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, heightened fear about mass violence, intensifying arguments about borders and culture, and a political atmosphere in the U.S. that often feels apocalyptic to one side and existential to the other. Layer on top of that the new kind of ambient dread that comes with climate anxiety, and now the rising public fear and fascination around AI. It's a lot of threat signals, a lot of alarms, a lot of reasons to feel like the ground is unstable. And the media environment has mirrored that intensity. Analyses of news tones suggest that the news has been more negative than economic and social fundamentals alone would predict, and that gap worsened in the early 2020s. The result is even when the emergency is technically over, the sensation of emergency stays. The virus recedes, but the adrenaline doesn't. So where does that leave us? Here's a verdict that pulls the threads together. The tragic 20s aren't primarily a mystery around incomes. They're a combined story about higher prices and shaken expectations, plus collapsing trust, plus more time spent alone, all amplified by a media and social ecosystem that is really good at keeping our nervous systems on edge. Inflation makes today feel harder to afford. Social media makes tomorrow feel harder to reach because you're constantly watching other people's highlight reels and comparing your bloopers to their best moments. Declining confidence in institutions makes people feel like nobody is in charge, or worse, that people in charge don't deserve the job. And isolation weakens the basic community buffers that help humans cope with stress. In other words, even if the economy is good, life can feel precarious, untrustworthy, and emotionally loud. If you're listening and thinking, okay, but what do we do with that? Thompson maintains the first step is simply to take the feelings seriously without treating them as irrational. A lot of this sadness is a signal. It's pointing to affordability pressure, to the importance of social connection, to the need for trustworthy institutions, and to the dangers of living in a permanent state of mediated crisis. The pandemic may have ended as a public health emergency, but as a social force, it left behind a new baseline, more expensive, more isolated, more distrustful, and more overwhelmed. And until we address those conditions, we shouldn't be surprised if Americans keep answering the happiness question the same way, with a number that's lower than the country's bank account would suggest.